talk to you about the Discover Materials Infographic Challenge. In this challenge, we would like you to create an infographic that highlights and explores a material that has been important to you during the pandemic. This could be important to you personally, something that has helped you through these chaotic and challenging times. It could be important perhaps for your family to make your lives more, easier to live. It could be important for wider society, something that has manifests itself as critical for us to move forward collectively and address the immediate and future needs. This could span something directly related to COVID-19, or it could be related to something that just you are more aware of in your day-to-day life. The important aspect is to focus on the material itself. To do this, you'll have to think up the idea, and you'll have to come up with a few bits of research to make sure that you have a good understanding of what makes that material most suitable, both, if possible, with regards to a technical aspect, but also with regards to the engineering. Why is it the most useful material or the most successful in that application? We've got some prizes to incentivize people to get involved in this activity, and we've got the top 2 infographics as judged by a panel, and we're going to look for things which are related to the visual appeal of the infographic. We're going to look for the content, and this content is not only the facts, but also the opportunity to show depth of understanding and the breadth of understanding to give you that context for why that material has been important. It should cover a range of different sources of where you found that information about that material. To compete in this competition, you just need to email the graphic file that you produce to info@discovermaterials.uk. This should be submitted by 9 p.m. British Summer Time on Sunday the 2nd of August, and you should submit this as a picture file. Within the image itself, you should include your name to credit yourself for that work, and in submitting this infographic to be judged, you are agreeing that this graphic could be shared by the Discover Materials grouping more widely. So when we ask this question, you might be asking yourself, you've seen a few infographics, you've perhaps seen them shared on social media channels or elsewhere. You've seen them perhaps in newspaper articles. What is a good infographic? Well, I would suggest that a good infographic draws together 4 key themes. We draw together the data, that information you would like to convey and simplify in communicating towards your audience. It draws this data together into a narrative or story that is created through the design of the infographic itself. This simplifies the complicated idea into something that conveys that story, much like you sort of read a comic book. You read panel to panel to tell you how the characters, that data in our infographic, link themselves together. And a successful infographic is something that is shareable. It persuades the reader that this is information worth sharing beyond themselves. And so it creates this sort of viral attitude towards the idea that you wish to share. Now, the overlap of these ideas, you can see that if you have a good design that is shareable, there is a liability because you may have something that is incorrect. So you need to ensure that there is something with the data to join this together. If you have data with just good design, this could be underachieving because it's not telling you that story and it's not creating it in a shareable narrative. If the data is just linked to the story and you've forgotten about the design or the audience that you wish to convey this to, then this is going to be invisible and how it's not shared more widely and the data is not shared to its full potential. If it's just a story that you're sharing and there's no underlying data and the design is not included, then it is perhaps embarrassing in how this is shared. And we can see this, that the sort of risks are outlined around the edge, but if we get these 4 ideas joined together, then we can create an infographic that is both informative, it's useful, and it's interesting. It's got this shareable potential that not just you find it interesting, but other people might find it interesting and share the ideas and propagate them through society. So the infographic fulfills one of the ideas we have in any material science and engineering degree, that we want to persuade you not only to understand a story, we want you to be able to tell that story itself, we want you to be able to share that story, perhaps with other engineers or scientists, perhaps with your supervisor or team, research team, or team in industry who's designing and developing the next great technology. It might also need to be shared with the general public, perhaps your investors, or the end users of your product. The idea here is that we know that everything is very complex. It can be very difficult, and there's a lot of challenges involved in understanding the nuance to that engineering. So what we're asking here is, in the selling of this idea through the infographic, that we're asking you to reduce the complexity. And we want you in that reduction, in that storytelling, to highlight what is important and interesting. So, to do this, we take the narrative that we'd like to link together: data, design, story, and shareability. If we look at some infographics that already exist, and I just found a few that I found interesting within the context of engineering, we can see and we can ask ourselves back to those 4 ideas. What is the data that is presented within this figure? Well, the key data, there's actually very little, but it's joined together to highlight, and it's in the center of this narrative. This is talking about the mastering modern building. A key aspect is the cost. How do we finance this project? And effectively only the cost, how we make this engineering successful, some of it, a large proportion, is related to the commercial building's construction cost. A significant cost is going to be associated with the longer term operational costs, and a significant part is also then going to be the value that this has to the owners. And that's how we can consider the different parts that will give rise to the mastering of the modern building. This is important, and this is where we ask ourselves, who does this infographic talk to? Well, it talks to people who want to understand the planning and programming involved in this engineering challenge. The infographic itself continues to think about the story, to tell narratives that link together a building as the idea of sort of joining together a body, where there are aspects to it that we see, the skin, etc., of the human body, but also the bits behind the scene that make the body interesting. How it functions is related to the brain, or perhaps some smart technology in the building itself. Perhaps it's the electricity, plumbing, the air conditioning, etc. Another aspect is who is involved, who is going to create this modern building. Well, there's sort of a general architect, and we want to have that general architect who will basically dot the I's, cross the T's, and do a lot of the heavy lifting behind the scenes. But what we would really like to make this really successful is we'd like to have a good architect who starts off with the assembly in this general idea to create this overall building. This good architect who's going to listen, analyse, and seek to understand the owner's needs. So the owner will consult with that sort of good architect or good architectural team, will design the suitable active building systems based upon clear requirements. And then it will engage more widely with architects and with other engineering consultants to create the modern building. So the ideas within this story are relatively simple. There are bits that we may not like or we may like in the infographics that we see. One of the aspects here is that we can consider that 50% of this infographic is devoted to setting the case or setting the story. It's telling us about what are the building structures that are involved. It's telling us about the different parts. It's a visual metaphor for mastering modern building. So for our first exercise, what we can do is we want to identify each element within an infographic. I've got some suggestions here that I can talk you through, but I'd strongly suggest that you find a few infographics that interest you, that start you off and enable you to start breaking down the idea of what makes a good infographic, so then you can think and you can translate those ideas into the creation of your own infographic. In bullet points, I suggest on a piece of paper, be active in your learning. I would describe what you like and what you dislike, what top level things come to mind for each of those infographics. I'd like you to also consider, if you were to create this infographic yourself, what would you like to see more or less of within the infographic? You should consider how the story is built up and how it's linked together. Are there visual cues, or is there spacing or structure within the infographic itself? And then consider what makes it shareable and to what audience would this be interesting. So each of these ideas link back to our data, story and design that then links that encompassing shareability that makes that idea go viral. So our first infographic for us to explore together, how much fuel does it take to power a light bulb for a year? I love this infographic. I work in the energy sector, and we do a lot of work to understand in particular nuclear power. So this infographic, the central idea is about a light bulb, is about powering that light bulb for a year. So we've taken up a lot of the story, and the nice thing about that light bulb metaphor is it's all about ideas. It's about just conveying this simplistic idea. We can use the wires to tell the visual narrative of each of these components independently supporting the wind. We can also see that there's a choice in the font sizes. The top level, the largest fonts and largest areas give you those top level ideas. So wind, for instance, a wind farm, 1.5 megawatts, would have to operate at 25% capacity for 2 hours, 20 minutes and 9 seconds to power our light bulb for a year. We can see there is a qualification of what the story is behind, and again that font size is used to enable us to dive to different depths. So we can see at a top level, we can see the immediate comparison between the different electricity generation technologies, and we can see, if I'm interested in these bits and pieces, I can then dive down into more detail. What I can ask myself, and perhaps a weakness of this, is where do I learn more? What would I do to reach out beyond the infographic itself? But overall, it's really nice. It's got a limited number of colours. They're relatively simple to show that effectively they're consistent motifs or designs between the different items. They're simplified bits and pieces of what's involved. The top level figures are really important in terms of, say, time on the renewable technologies or fuel consumption on the fossil and nuclear technologies. We can see that then there is that extra detail, and it's limited to a few bullet points, so we're not overwhelming the reader with information here. And the top level story is put at the top of the story, so as we read it we can see the top, we can consider the central aspects of this story, and then we can read about each of the different technologies in turn. So if we go back to the question, data, story and design, well, the data is encompassed actually in the very lower level part of the figure, and it's told with simplistic points, but each of them are equivalent. And we see the data is equivalent visually on the right hand side of the graphic, as well as it's equivalent visually on the left hand side. But there is a separation of ideas between the left and the right because of the different technologies that are involved. If we consider the story is built up by the visual narrative of the light bulb joining to each of the individual technologies. They're independently constructed, and then the story is that each of these independent stories are effectively broken down by font size and font colours. The story is also the comparison between the different technologies that's clearly visually brought out, and the story is contextualised by the top level question up here. As we go to our next infographic, Nanomaterials, this is closer to the topic in question, we can again ask ourselves, what do we like, what do we dislike? What we can like here is that there's a limited visual palette. There are of the order of 4 or 5 different colours, each with a limited number of shades. The font size again gives that hierarchy of ideas. Perhaps there is a bit too much text. The take home of this, it requires someone who is quite invested in nanomaterials to really get involved and think about the context of this story. But the depth of information conveyed is very, very large. So you sort of have this trade-off between the vested information that people may want to get from their story to the detail that you can convey. And this will depend a little bit on the scope of the infographic that you want to talk about. So although nanomaterials are small materials themselves at the nanometer length scale, of the order of the size of a virus or red blood cell in this particular figure. There are lots and lots of different ones, and they impact our lives across a series of different applications in these parts. And we see there is a balance, so we have here are the applications, and we see the balance is, if we like these applications, how do they link across to different hazards? And then we see a significant area of study and understanding is important of how they will interact with the biosphere and human beings. And so the health effects, that's a really critical point that we should say, yes, these nanomaterials are very exciting, but we've also got to consider how they will affect the human beings and other parts of wider society and the environment itself. And then on the right-hand side, we can see what are workplaces supposed to do to consider their implementation and use of these technologies. So we can see there are considerations with regards to screening materials before they enter the workplace. If I ship any nanomaterials to a research partner, I have to clearly say on some paperwork what they are, so people know how to handle them safely before opening an unknown package, for instance. There is education and training. There is specific legal points within that, but there is also things that will be important for your workplace. How you limit perhaps the contamination of these materials. The really nice thing I love about this particular figure is it has specific resources to link out. So I really like in here that it's got that way to dive beyond the infographic itself and say, this has drawn me into the story, where can I find more? And they are from reliable third-party sources. Specifically in this case, it's against the Canadian Safety Regulator. I like this figure. It's very complete. I dislike it's perhaps a bit too detailed. But again, it depends on that audience. Who are you going to get interested in this? This perhaps is interesting towards someone who has a vague interest in nanomaterials. It's not going to grab everybody off the street, but it will grab someone who is interested in science, technology, engineering and maths. We've discussed this modern building, but we can now consider again back to what do we like and dislike. The contrast I draw you back to is that this is a much simpler story. It still conveys that inspiration that we should be interested in the whole story of planning, but the contrast against the prior figure is now very apparent. So exercise 2, well, what I would suggest first is find your own couple of infographics and repeat exercise 1. But for exercise 2 itself, it's then now start to sketch or create an infographic of your own choice. I would suggest for exercise 2 that you consider information about a hobby, perhaps, some engineering topic or science topic that's interesting to you, or perhaps something about your hometown. And you start to put together that visual narrative that enables you to tell a story, to convey information or data, to create it in a shareable format, and to have that visual design that simplifies what you want to do. Spend a bit of time. It's going to take about probably half an hour to an hour to come up with a nice part. And the reason why this will take a little bit longer is because you should really get some feedback. Go and find some other people to say, I'm trying to do this thing. Be clear about what you're asking of those people. And then when you've done that, consider what you can include. You should identify the audience that you want to sell this infographic towards, and you want to say what would they find useful in the infographic. Once you've had a little bit of feedback and considered it yourself and gone back and tested it against exercise 1, you can refine this design, perhaps in a second sketch. Once you've had a go with this, what you can then do is you can take these ideas and use this to solve the challenge that we've set. One aspect is to consider in the visual design that you should simplify. And a key part of simplification, as shown within this figure, is you need to think about what is essential to tell your story. In here, this is showing that we can actually tell the story with limited amounts of graphical data by cutting out all of the ink that is not about the data itself. And we're just going to highlight in this example the calories from bacon as presented against other parts. And this is a really important story. In all of our science and engineering, we try to reduce and clarify to send a message and tell the story that is focused on the detail that we think is interesting and want to convey. This is a really useful skill to reduce what's called the data ink in your graphical displays. So we can see each of these slides. You can stop at any point in this story about what you think is important. You can stop and break it down to an intermediate point, but you can see how the extreme of effectively just having these bars with the calories per 100, that could be enough to tell the visual metaphor of what's the difference between the different bars and the key numeric detail that's included in the overlay of those numbers. There are a huge range of resources, and these are linked in the PDF pack as well, but effectively there's a series of bits of some visual stories to give you a bit more depth of the theory and knowledge of creating successful infographics. One aspect that will be important for the competition is for you to get familiar and comfortable with a sufficient tool. Inkscape itself is free and downloadable. It will take you a little bit of time to get used to it, but it's a really cool graphical tool. But many of the infographics that we create them in relatively simple tools, things like Microsoft Paint, within PowerPoint itself or within Google Slides. Find a tool that you're comfortable with. As with any of these, you might want to learn a few tricks or tips with those tools, but it's more important to spend time on the creation of the infographic rather than losing yourself into too much of the technology on here. And have a look at these guys. There's also a few books that you may want to have a look at, and there's a wonderful book called Information is Beautiful by David McCondless. And then there's also the visual display of quantitative information that introduces the first bit on data ink in these resources. So just to give you a reminder, there is a prize for the top 2 infographics. The judges will look for they'll judge this based upon 3 criteria: the visual appeal, the contents, which includes facts, a balance of facts, depth and breadth conveyed in here, and it will be across also we would like to see from a range of sources to show that you've done the research to understand the topic that's present. In order for you to compete in this competition, you must submit them via email, submit them as a picture file, typically a PNG or JPEG at an appropriate resolution, and you should submit them by 9 p.m. On Sunday the 2nd of August. With that, very good luck. There's going to be a little bit of Q&A, and you can get in contact via this address, or you can ask us for follow-up if you'd like some help along the way. Thank you very much for your time, and good luck with the competition.